Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining our Security Boulevard Roundtable. My name is Jared Harris, and welcome back to our TechStrong Learning Program. As always, this session is going to be recorded and available to you to view on demand afterwards. So during the program, please go ahead and ask us any questions, all questions. We want to hear them. This is going to be all about zero trust. We also want to communicate with you through the chat tab, which is also on the right side of your screen. Tell us where you're tuning in from. We've already got people from Germany, United States, South America, so feel free to do the same and let us know where you're signing in from. We'd love to hear. And finally, we're going to be giving out two $50 Amazon gift cards to two TechStrong Learning Experience users. So be sure to, again, send us your questions, give us your chat, your feedback, everything. We've also got a survey at the end of the program. You can also find that in the handouts, and let us know what you think about today's program. Let's go ahead and get this kicked off. Today's topic is how to define zero trust strategy across multiple IT silos. We are joined today with Chris Lindsay, Application Security Evangelist at Mend.io, Zach Hill, Chief Architect at Anchor, Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer at TechStrong Group. Thank you, Chris, Zach, and Mike for joining us today. Mike, I'm going to go ahead and turn the program over to you while I turn my camera off.
All right, great. Always happy to be here, folks. And yes, it is true. We're talking about zero trust, but it's one of those things where I think everybody hears that buzzword and they nod their head and they all go, yeah, I think I know what that means, maybe, or at least they have their own interpretation thereof. And there's context to be had across zero trust is at all layers of the stack. So, Chris, kind of walk us through where are we in terms of maturity of zero trust, and then how does it impact those folks in the land of software that we so much love?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Let's deep dive, because zero trust really goes so many different places and so many different layers that you're right. It's really hard to define, because with software zero trust, you're looking at APIs, you're looking at what's going on there, you're looking at your regular software, what's going on there, you're looking at your parameter, you're looking at your edge and your network. And you're right, everybody's talking about zero trust, but what does it really mean? And probably the easiest way to really just start out of the gate, zero trust, you don't trust anything coming over the wire until you validate it. That's probably one of the best ways to start, because so many people try to manipulate the data. Hey, this doesn't look right. Let me fix it. And then they try to go forward and bad things happen. So that's kind of an entry level. Hey, don't trust anything until you validate it.
All right, Zach, you want to add to that? Because I think Chris just gave us the 60s version of don't trust anybody over 30, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge topic. I completely agree. I like to think of it as, moving from a very granular, least privilege approach, right? Very granular, very deep, like everywhere you're looking at who's doing what. Do they still have permission to do what I think they're supposed to do? So it flows all the way from the edges. There is no edge. We hear a lot in the IT space in particular, with cloud extended. There's no boundaries. So moving those controls and security practices, not just like firewall kind of accept deny, but like process for responding to incidents and managing active incidents is moving all through the network at various boundaries and various layers across silos, right? Knowing who is who, like it's a really complicated topic, and there's lots of kind of layers as you start applying that in your org, both to external vendors, right, as you're bringing other people's software in, the software you're developing yourself, that often also has those external dependencies, right, creating those boundaries where we know what's happening, what do we expect, and what's the current state of things. It's a complicated topic, so it's definitely a significant endeavor for any IT shop to kind of go down that journey, and we don't want to trivialize it at all. It's a big step, especially if you have a well-established kind of boundary-oriented approach at the moment. So,
absolutely,
yeah, it touches everything. It's just endemic is what I think the main the main takeaway there is. Like, it's not one little thing; it's lots of stuff.
Yep.
Chris, why are we having this conversation now? And I'm old enough to remember maybe talking about zero trust more than 2 decades ago, maybe 3. People kind of started out with more of a hardware mentality about it. They were going to lock down the entire IT environment, and that didn't work out as well as we had hoped. But now, flash forward, here we are, and everybody's talking about zero trust, and they're talking about identities and how do I make sure that nobody has access to anything. Why are we having this conversation today, and is it doable for that matter?
Well, it's going to be hard. It's not an easy topic to implement. And the reason why, think of Game of Thrones, right? You've got all the soldiers going side to side, and you've got that one little line, that road going in between that goes up to the castle. And the problem is all the packets, as they're coming in, you have all your protections and everything that's trying to protect, your systems and your networks and everything that's all in place, all zero trust over there. If you have a good, well-crafted packet, it's going to go right down the road and make it to your castle. And the problem is the castle's your server. Once you're in the server, then all of a sudden, hey, it's malicious. Or, from an API standpoint, 20, 30 years ago, from a development standpoint, people were writing SQL injection right and left. People were not very familiar with security. In today's world, you have AI, you have these tools, you have this automation, ethical hacking tools that will go out and do amazing things if you're an ethical hacker. If you're not an ethical hacker, it's a candy store, right? And the reason why this is so important is because this technology has gotten better and we're now more security focused. Instead of the old days where, hey, you never really heard of people being compromised. Now it's everyday news. And developers, when they go to college, they're not learning secure programming practices. And because of that, they're coming out, and I call it notepad inheritance, where you copy and paste existing code. So an entry-level developer, they come in, hey, I'm working on the API. I need a method. Hey, this method looks very close to what I need. I copy and I paste it from here to here. I implement it. Now, guess what? I've just copied all the vulnerabilities from here and duplicated them over here. And I can go on, and I will give Zach a chance to chime in because I could probably talk the rest of the webinar on it.
Yeah. Again, there's so much going on. Like, why finally now? I think it was great. Yeah, we've been hearing this, for years, right? I look back at the Google Beyond Corp stuff. That was like 2011. Mm-hmm. So these are not new concepts. I think why we're hearing a lot more about it now is a mix of a few factors. Like, one was that super high profile, Sunburst incident, which scared a lot of people, right? That was a major trusted vendor that was a SolarWinds incident. That's the other word that we hear. Where, a trusted component, a critical component of software coming from a trusted vendor kind of escaped, right? And started and becoming malicious. And it wasn't that there was necessarily an intrusion, it was a software intrusion, right? There was no penetration from the outside in. It was the packet, the payload coming in that kind of expanded out. And that started people evaluating these in-depth security approaches, right? And thinking about how can we make sure that our boundaries are set such that inevitably something will get in, right? Either externally or from within. And how do we manage that and mitigate it and wall it off and be able to respond to it effectively? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's kind of the external driver of these approaches, these architectures gaining more popularity. I think there's also a nice confluence of why now, we have the technology, and a lot of even the open source projects are enabling people to do it feasibly, right? You don't have to have an org that can build custom NIC drive, network software. We have things like Kubernetes, things like container technologies that allow us to put the things like the sidecars that implement these things in a fairly straightforward and achievable way for a lot more organizations than we previously saw. So that's where I think the bar is lowering. It's still not easy. I don't want to minimize that, but there are projects out there. Enough people are building momentum around this that there's kind of approaches and tooling that's available that you can pull all that stuff down and actually start building one of those in your own organization without having to build it from scratch. And that's a big, I think, inflection point. Back in the Google days, that was they were custom building a lot of the infrastructure necessary to achieve these things. So it's now accessible. We have external motivators. We're seeing, government, the U.S. executive order not recently, a couple of years ago, started talking about moving the government towards zero trust architectures specifically, which we've not seen too many call outs of those kind of specific architecture recommendations. So it's gaining more popularity as an approach. How a given organization will implement it obviously is going to vary, but recognition that in this current distributed network, distributed workforce, there is no walled data center where you can protect everything very, very clearly. We have to apply these in-depth approaches. And so I think we're coalescing as an industry around this being a good model to proceed, and everybody will have parts they can do, things they can't do, but aligning their priority. And so it's a way to achieve that in-depth security that is so prevalent now, especially with the volume of software and volume of change coming in, right? Like Chris, you were talking about the people coming out. So the volume of code going through a given org is massive. Now everybody's a software company. You've got software teams, managers and executives managing software teams that didn't do that a lot before, right? And understanding how are we going to move fast but still maintain that security, and it needs to evolve. And these architectures help you wrap and contextualize that. To your point, Chris, around not everybody has to be a security expert, but we can move that boundary closer,
right,
into the edge.
Yeah, and people think just buying a tool is going to save you from the world, and it really kind of goes back, and you said it. Developer training. If developers are educated on what security vulnerabilities look like, and you start moving the needle that direction, now you're going to start actually seeing an overall improvement in your security tech debt. And the other thing too is you can go online, and there's so many tools that and just scripts. Hey, all you have to do is go plug in an IP address or an endpoint and hit the run button, and it'll come back and say, hey, here you go. Or penetration testing tools will come out and give you a wealth of knowledge passively. You're not even actively attacking, and you can see what's going on. Do we want to hit this question?
Well, we'll come back to that question. Let me ask you this though. It's a little overwhelming right now when I look at zero trust. And is there some way to think about this in terms of an architecture that I can carve it up in a way that makes it maybe a little more digestible, so I can sit there and kind of say, all right, well, the networking team needs to do this, the software team needs to do this, the security people should be doing X. I mean, how should we think about this? Chris, you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do. So I'm going to use APIs as a good example because it crosses over so much. Intercompany, from mobile applications, business to business, APIs, for your web, front end. I mean, it's everywhere. And essentially, the biggest thing that I preached for years and years to my development teams, and I implemented as well, is do not trust the data coming in until you can validate it. And if you have something like a prompt, something on the UI that's 30 characters and the data exceeds 30 characters, somebody did something wrong. It's either incorrectly coded on the other side, or your side may, somebody may be doing a man in the middle, or, maybe trying to attack you. And so, going in and saying, hey, look, here's the payload. Does it meet all the requirements? Does it have everything? Does it look clean? I mean, it's passed through. You probably have turned on a web application firewall. The networking and the edge guys, can do so much. But again, if a packet looks good and the packet is clean, according to the common parameters, really it goes into, at that point, your application. And again, taking that, not, until you can validate and say this payload is good. If it for any reason it's not good, throw it away. Log it and throw it away. So many teams I have seen over the years will go, well, it's more than the 30 characters. I'm going to truncate at 30 characters. What are you doing? If you're truncating data to make it fit and work, something else is going on.
Zach, any thoughts about how to structure this thing? Because I think a lot of people, they get out of bed some mornings and they're like, yep, let's go get some zero trust. And then they look at all that and they go, my God, I'm going back to bed. It's too complicated.
I've thought that myself more than once, for sure. I think kind of putting it into phases, right? Understanding, like Chris is describing, also requires kind of visibility and observability. So there's a lot of aspects where you got to get the building blocks in place first before you can start building these approaches and these architectures, because you need to be able to see, is it working? How is it working? Like, something will go wrong. Make sure that you have a way to address that. Or the development teams, right? The engineering managers that need to deliver product or need to deliver some value into the company are going to be like, no, this is just costing us too much. It's too much friction. And they'll either start working around the architecture, which I've seen before, or they'll start, pushing back and trying to make the boundaries bigger and bigger and give themselves a bigger bubble. And then, you're starting to trust things you didn't necessarily want to. So I think kind of getting the baseline, understanding, what is running, where are these things running, what is inside of them, right? This segues nice into kind of the SEA side, the SBOM, like understanding what is where in your environments, what are the libraries they're using across your entire infrastructure, and starting to kind of build that baseline from the bottom up can be really helpful. That way, in parallel, as you're doing the developer training, as they're making defensive applications at the application layer, right, you can leverage that and see, what are the incidents of that actually occurring? Where are things? Do we have the control levers? If something's not in place, but we still suspect, some external activity, we can turn things off and kind of rein it back in. So I think moving in phases, starting from core observability, understanding identity, what is where, who, making sure those identity tokens are moving through your APIs, through the layers, that you don't just map everything onto the root credential, so to speak, and then from there, logically within the network or within your application stack, that request path has full permission to do everything, right? Carrying that context, even if you don't use it yet, just seeing it, be able to observe it is the first step, and then you can start applying doing the other hard work in the highest priority areas, the areas are highest risk or most valuable for you, or highest risk for you as a business. Because trying to do it 100%, zero trust is not binary, right? You didn't achieve it or not. It's a gradient, and so you want to roll that out and apply it across your org in the areas where you're most sensitive, and define how much risk you're willing to tolerate as you move across your infrastructure.
Right.
And that's the hard bit, is deciding what that gradient looks like.
Well, and Zach, you also bring up a good point. When you're hitting an endpoint, do you have access to pull the data? A lot of people have multi-tenant systems where they're not doing appropriate checks. And at that point, you can start taking data, or, if you're not logging anything on the back end, you're not going to realize that somebody is sitting there scraping all your data across the board from multiple, entry points. And the other thing too, as far as the architecture goes, and you were talking about this, even internally, I wouldn't trust the data coming in. I would still validate the data, even from an internal system coming in, because you don't know, has that system been compromised, or, what's going on there. And the tokens, that you were bringing up too, is absolutely critical. And make sure that you have a good expiration on the tokens, because too many people will put a 12 or 24-hour period on tokens, and that's just too long.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Zach, we got a question from the audience that kind of leans into your expertise, so let's go with it. But it basically comes under the heading of no good deed goes unpunished. So you put all the zero trust stuff in place and everything looks great, and then performance and user experience falls through the floor. So how do I kind of put something like this in place without getting in the way of the application experience?
Yeah, that's one of those definitely challenging trade-offs, right? Anytime we add any more processing in, and if you're very latency sensitive, then you got to justify all of that. So I think that's where you want to approach kind of, where are those boundaries that you really need it, right? Like, portion it and understand where's the trade-off that you're getting for that. Look at optimization at your highest value areas. So we've certainly seen in the past some open source libraries or other things that are just not performant for the way we're trying to use it. You need to kind of go in and invest to address that for your specific application and the layering that you need, or find ways to kind of mitigate those latencies with caches and other things, and ways that you can kind of not have to pay that price every single request, but getting close and understand, sampling and things like that you can use to spread it out a little bit. Again, it's not just the network layer, so that's where often the latency considerations come in at the network, but we kind of want to push through that. And even we've seen situations where we can simplify the network architectures a bit, right? If we have that in depth, maybe don't need as many layers in front at the edge. We can kind of absorb it across the spectrum, which helps us only pay the price when we actually need to. So there's several strategies. It becomes very application specific, but we'd love to hear kind of where, if there's any more information, like where specifically you're seeing these issues and kind of which boundaries are the biggest problems for folks. I'd love to have those conversations.
All right. Well, that was a request back to the audience to kick in some ideas, and we'll come back to this in a minute. But Chris, I don't know if you got any thoughts on this.
I think you nailed it. Really, when you start implementing security, it's going to be hard. It's not an easy thing to do. And as your developers are writing the tools or the software, and as the tools are identifying the vulnerabilities, you got to pick on what's important to you. You know, if you have command execution issue or command injection that's happening on the back end, that's important. Focus on it. If it's on the front end, where if it's a JavaScript or something on the client side, it doesn't matter. And so, because they're already on the box, or just depending on the application, every application is different. So, you know, it's really about the application and, you know, what the vulnerability is. But the big thing is you're right, you know, Zach, it's a heavy process to implement. And, you know, you are going to find that, you know, the experience may be slightly degraded. And Zach, you know, mentioned several things that you can do, you know, cache some of the data, or, you know, there's ways to work around it. And if you're running into slowness or problems with your implementation, take a step back and look at how are you implementing it. I'll get into the weeds here real quick, but not too long. If you're implementing something like a multi-tenant system in the SQL Server versus up above, you may have different calls, multiple calls versus one single call. When you're inside of a store proc and you're validating the role-based access, you know, if it's something that's not performing well, there's ways to tune it, indexes and other things. But you may find yourself in a hole where you've done everything you possibly can, and you're not, you know, successful there as far as performance goes. You need to, you know, look at what is it going to take, you know, maybe take a step back and re-architect it, you know, that section, and take a different approach or a different viewpoint into it. Because sometimes if you've written something 10, 15 years ago, you're programmed into a corner. And sometimes taking a step back and looking at it from a higher perspective, you might realize, hey, there is a better way to accomplish what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's also one of the challenges where this is not just a security function or just a network function, right? Like the whole application has to understand it's going to be a zero trust thing. So to your point, Chris, like the development teams need to understand this and be on board. It's not something you can kind of just apply in a vacuum on existing infrastructure and expect it to just work. Mm-hmm. It's a holistic approach.
Well, the attendee who started this conversation is back, and I was wondering if there's any examples where you can see some way to simplify the network. Because to your point, if I gotta maybe add some layers of security, maybe I can flatten the network and make it less, reduce the friction, as they say. So I don't know, Zach, if you got
don't have like a
in that
library
mind,
of specific diagrams. I wish it was that easy to be like, here's the network diagram, you know, for an optimal flow. I think what I usually look at is like, what are we validating here at this point, right? Is that something I can move upstream? Can I move it downstream? Like looking at all the steps. You know, where's the performance hit? Is it in the authentication phase of the validation? Do we need to optimize that flow and either constrain, you know, the set of possible, or to Chris's point, look at the application, right? Why does at this point it need to have access to all of the different users' data, right? Maybe we can segment the data itself up so that all I have to validate is like I'm talking to the database that is sharded with just that user or some subset of users. So reducing those surfaces, you know, sometimes those performance issues can be across the architecture, and you need to again raise kind of your view on it. It's a complicated topic. I think that's where getting all the players together, it's not something that security can just throw on the network team or throw on the app management team or the platform team. It's a pervasive problem or challenge that needs, you know, proper kind of, I'll say DevOps and DevSecOps approaches to everybody got to understand you have to have to have a cycle for getting the feedback, addressing it, iterating, and thinking of these things just like bugs in the software, right? Like they're things that we need to find, monitor, observe, resolve, measure that we fixed it, and improve it as we iterate.
Well, and the big thing. Oh,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
And the other thing to consider or think about is if you're logging, set different logging levels. Give yourself the ability to go in and be extremely detailed. By doing so, you can see how much time things are taking, and so you can do some analytics on it. If your slowness is network layer, now you know. If it's internal, to a certain area, now you know. And as Zach said, you've got to really bring everybody to into a room and talk about, hey, this is what we're doing. Here's how we're going to accomplish it. Here's why we're doing it. A big question that we had at a previous company when we were doing some design work internally, are we going to let the data go across port 80 unencrypted, or are we going to go 443 and still be encrypted within the network? And so these are decisions that need to be made. And when you're doing a lot of heavy lifting, encrypting and changing and data things, again, you may want to offload it to a process or a microservice or some kind of aspect that you can make it wider and more reactive, time wise. If it's a heavy process, offload it, right?
I'm sure when you got that port question, somebody said yes, which is all the above, right? So you talked about surfaces, and we have an attendee who's, it's a cryptic question. It just says, what about OT devices? But I'll add to it in the sense that, so we are seeing new devices added to the network all the time. And, is that outpacing our ability to implement zero trust? And I don't think we get to say stop. So how do we kind of deal with this constant expanded surface that we're being asked to manage and secure? Chris, you want to start with that one?
Sure. You know what? Let everything, plug it in, let it roll. I mean, I can plug in a pineapple, access point in and just let everything roll and have fun, right? The reality is really, it just depends on your company, what you're doing, the size of your company. This is not an easy answer. If you're a very small company, I think you take a different approach where you lock things down. Let me talk firewalls real quick. In the old days, you'd buy a firewall or some kind of network appliance, and all the ports were active. And here you go, plug in, and you're rolling, right? In today's world, if you go buy a Palo or a SonicWall or any kind of real firewall Cisco device, everything's going to be turned off. Every port's going to be turned off until you activate it, until you turn it on, until you specify this port does X, Y, and Z. Gone are the days where you just buy, even for home, right, a router, right? Gone are the days you plug in and just roll. Now you got to set, hey, the user accounts, the passwords, all this stuff. So zero trust has really kind of come to all the different layers. But to answer your question, depends on the size of your company. If you're small enough, I would almost try to block anything that's plugged in until you can authenticate it or authorize it. If you're a really large enterprise, that's never going to fly.
Yeah, Zach, I mean, I feel like it's part of this quandary that we're all in with security, in the sense that everybody is held accountable, but they have no authority to say no. So everything just gets attached anyway, and we're always chasing after it. Or are we on some sort of infinite hamster loop here?
Well, we're trying to avoid the infinite hamster loops. That's for sure. But that's frustrating to everybody. We feel like we're not getting any value, and that's not a way to make progress. I think where it gets really frustrating is when we don't quite understand what the objectives are, right? Like we try to make blanket policies. It's like, we're going to do this, and when you ask why, because I need to get my job done, right? It's almost always somebody's trying to get their job done. They're trying to help deliver value to the company or do their work better. And so being able to understand those things and help with that communication flow. So, to Chris's point, block, but then I have an way that we review, quickly, and have automation to help us, review the request. And yep, that makes sense. We're going to allow it. And we have the follow-up monitoring to make sure that that device and those things are behaving the way we expect them to. So it's not just like letting it in, but also tracking things over time and understanding, are they meeting the expectations that we set when we allowed it? And so a lot of this, I think, comes to process and making sure that you've kind of reduce the friction for your users, right? You've got to put controls in place, but you want them on the happy path, right? You want them doing the things the way they're supposed to be and making sure that that's as easy as possible. And that's where it's that people and process layered on top of technology that is really important. Why does your phone need to be accessing protected telnet network connect, internal, like that should never be doing those things, right? But HTTP pushing out, specific well-protected endpoints that everybody can talk to, like, moving the boundaries around a little bit can help with that. But instead of letting things in, maybe push something out. Let's put it out there, and now we accept a connection to this from anywhere on the internet, and we've secured that. That's the only place that we're allowing application traffic to come in through a well understood, well tested, and well verified, like web endpoint, rather than using tunnels to get into protected networks. Like, those are different kind of approaches for achieving similar application delivery goals, but they move your control point quite a bit and can help you provide that a little more easily. It's definitely a challenging situation, especially with the amount of devices that we see.
All right. Well, Chris, we have two questions that are building on that first question you wanted to get to earlier. So let's go there. There's a question is fundamentally, how do you kind of do this when you have all these cross-functional teams, and how do I build those workflows and those processes? And then how do I do that across multiple IT silos on top of that? I mean, it seems to me that this is as much a people change management issue as it is a technology issue. But, what's your advice to folks?
So, I'll talk network and then I'll talk application. From a network standpoint, it's all about whitelisting. Even, internal silo to internal silo, make sure that you're actually knowing who's coming into your application, if you're coming into an app or your resource or whatever you're allowing traffic in. It's just always a good practice to be whitelisting versus blacklisting, because blacklisting, you're just always going to be chasing, after the wind. Whitelisting is really going to be one of those things where, it's a heavy lift up front, but you can do some automation around that where, if something needs to be automated and allowed, you can make a quicker process. From an application standpoint, you may have people that are accessing your APIs or your system for multiple reasons. And the thing is your application and what you're doing. I was part of a medication prescribing system at my previous employment, and I had written a lot of it. And we had external systems that were reaching in to do things. If I blindly allowed certain things to just happen, the problem is a medication may be prescribed that did not meet all the requirements, and it could hurt somebody. And so the reason why you want to make sure that your application and you lock it down so that the proper requests have to be, properly formatted to come through. If they're not properly formatted, what's going to happen if something comes through that's not right? Now, from a security standpoint, beyond that, we kind of hit SAST and SCA and some of the other things earlier. Again, it goes back to you've also got to be secure there, because if a good request comes in, you still have something that could be malicious, even internal to internal. But when you have multiple silos within a company and they're trying to reach a resource, again, I know it's painful, but in my opinion, in a zero trust environment, you're looking at whitelisting versus, other things.
All right. Well, we have another practical question along that line, but Zach, maybe you can start with this one. But how do we have this conversation with the senior leadership teams? Because all they want to have is the great experience, and that's what they're investing in. So how do we get them on board in a way where they get behind this versus kind of just looking at it as some sort of tax to be avoided?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a couple of dimensions to the answer. One is acknowledging that it's going to be painful, kind of getting that direction. But once you've kind of gotten there, then you have some flexibility and capabilities you didn't have before, right? Like, one of the things I really like about zero trust architectures is what we talked about earlier. Like, everything is kind of the same. There's no special like us and them. It's just things, right, that are understood and identified and given permission. So that can actually give you a lot of flexibility and iterability later on, because you can move and just adding new apps, whether it's yours or a vendor, like, it's kind of the same process. You have to evaluate each individually, but you're not making these weird one-off architecture designs for some strange app because they need, like, there's a structure, it has to flow into it. They understand what the checklists are. You need to understand who it talks to, what it's talking about. And it lets you iterate more quickly because you have a general architecture and design that can support a range, wide range of applications without each one having to have bespoke security processes and security reviews and lots of like siloed information where two security engineers are the only ones that know how this thing works. So they're the only ones that can do, acceptance requests. So it can have some longer term advantages as you build that machinery. So you're going to pay kind of an upfront cost. Once you get there, in addition to the security stuff, you have a repeatable process and architecture that can expand and grow with you, regardless of some of the infrastructure choices you might make. If you want to move hybrid, if you want to do multi-cloud, like all those kind of high-level business initiatives, cost-cutting, move to a different cloud, your zero trust stuff can migrate with you because you're not relying on very specific features of a very specific platform.
Chris, is it getting easier to have those conversations? I've talked to one person recently, spent a few years trying to get themselves some time in front of the board of directors, and then they got there and they were more frustrated when they didn't have access because the folks had no idea what he was talking about.
So the question you ask, do we sound good on the news? Because if we're on the news for a breach or data loss or for anything critical, how's that going to impact you guys? That's the question that I would ask the board is, how important is, staying out of the news to you? If you're a board that does not care about news stories, hey, guess what? We're in the news again for data loss. That's a very bad spot to be in. And that's kind of where I would probably start the conversation. Start and level set with them. Hey, this is why we're doing the things we're doing. Here's the value it brings. Is this painful? Is it a heavy tax up front to get implemented? Absolutely. But, and Zach hit it on the head, right? As you start going down this path, it's not easy to get started. But once you actually have a process in place and a plan in place, as you start going down the road with this, it's going to get easier. And as new things, are being integrated, or merger and acquisition, you've brought in a new acquisition to your company, you already have the processes in place to start bringing them on. And the question becomes, if you're not zero trust and you bring in a product that is not secure and you brought it into your network, again, you're going to make the news really quickly. Hey, we were compromised. We had this third-party acquisition. We acquired this company, brought them in, and guess what? It was bad news.
So you're just saying stay off the proverbial front page, as it were. Zach, I think a lot of times the senior leaders think that this is something we're about to go achieve or do, and their natural inclination is to go, okay, well, how long will it take us to get there? But I got a feeling the thing about zero trust is we're never, ever fully done, right? And so how do you communicate that with somebody and say, hey, this is a thing we're going to live with forever, as opposed to we're not going to sit around and say, here's a memo in 9 months that says we've achieved it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where I would fall back to that kind of prioritization and phases, right? Understanding what's the highest value and understanding, we're using terms like defense in depth and other things that people understand. And also being able to lean on some of the external government and other requirements and these things like that executive order that we hear about, where the government is now starting to say, we need to do, zero trust architectures and start rolling those out. Like those are bellwethers that now your board is going to be asked, like, why didn't you do that, right? When something happens, not why did, because they're becoming more standard across the industry. And so as you roll that out, it's around how much are we trusting, not zero. You'll never get quite to zero. It's a great idea, but at some point you have to, you trust because the data looks good and the identity is there. So you're making decisions to allow things, but where is that? Are you protecting the things that are most valuable to you? So you might be able to make some trade-offs there, and understanding the risk, the threat modeling that you get. The good security teams are really good at understanding what's the threat model at given places in your system. And I don't say network because it's not just a network question, but in your system, your end to end. And are you protecting those bits first? And so you can kind of roll out and hit hit the highest priority stuff first, which often is the most painful because it's maybe a lot of the oldest legacy stuff, but kind of building the wall and kind of shrinking it back over time. So you're getting, okay, now we can efficiently, allow list these things with our time to response to an allow list request is gone from a week down to 2 days, down to 45 minutes, right? Those kinds of things. We're maintaining our security, but allowing our teams to move faster and get the work that they need done. And those are good metrics for showing, yep, we're reducing the friction with a common security stance. So rather than thinking like we achieved security, it's like we're doing security and we're doing it more efficiently and with less overhead. That's kind of a metric that I like to use when describing.
All right. So, Chris, in your experience, who kind of leads the charge on zero trust? Who is the person in the organization who says we got to get our act together and this is going to become a corporate-wide initiative? Because it seems like everybody has a piece of it, so maybe nobody's responsible for it, and that's why nothing ever seems to feel like progress.
I honestly, everybody sees zero trust differently. And, the networking guys, they have their terminology. The developers have their terminology. The architects that are in between, the people who are the project management guys, PMOs, they have their own, idea of what it is. Really, honestly, it's really at multiple layers. You're right. So many people own it. I don't know in a very large organization if you would have a single person. If I were going to put a stamp on anybody, maybe the CISO, but really the part is you're going to have the director of the networking side, the director of your application security side, at a minimum need to be in a room talking through what does zero trust look like, because if you're not coordinating and working together, it's gonna be a mess.
This just came up from one of the attendees, and I know it's been an issue, but a lot of times we associate zero trust with identity. So let's start here with Zach. And the question is about privileges. And almost every time I see an attack, it's somebody's credentials are compromised, and then those were then used to escalate privileges. And you can't help but wonder sometimes, it seems like it's pretty trivial to escalate privileges. So is part of our issue just that we're bad at managing privileges and we tend to give them out willy-nilly, and we just need to have a little discipline here? Zach, what do you think?
That's a great question. I think a lot of that, so I think, yes, we tend to be lax on managing privileges, but the reason why is important. And I think a lot of that is, again, going back to people trying to get their jobs done, right? And so if you don't understand an application and we're not able to communicate and articulate, my application needs these privileges for this reason in these contexts, right? That's not a thing that a lot of teams are used to talking about, right? And used to communicating in efficient ways. And so when things get hairy, right, when there's an outage and your ops team, they just apply, or you need to onboard a new application and we don't quite understand, so we just expand it to get it working. And that's where I think the communication and process is really important, so you can understand. And the other acknowledgement is that sometimes you're going to get it wrong. So how do you respond when that does happen, right? How do we pare a privilege back, understanding who will it impact if I change the privilege of this identity, and making sure those lines of communication are there between the teams and the technical owners, so they can make those decisions quickly and understand the impact. Because even with zero trust, I think one of those security fallacies that if we do this, we will never be compromised, right? Attackers are active; they're probing for weaknesses. So you're always going to be responding to things, whether they're operational, and something has happened and your team needs to respond and they need to escalate privileges for a while to take care of some business and then bring it back down, or something is actually compromised and you need to fence it off and isolate it and understand what's happening. So a lot of it just comes from understanding what's running and where, and all the different components to build those threat models. That's one of the great things about these zero trust things is once you have the understanding of what is where, you have the privileged discussions. You can discuss, do we really need that permission? Like, why are we giving this application this permission? And it may be to respond to an incident 6 months ago that was long and nobody just turned it back off, right? But when you have that data laid out in front of you, that observability, then you can have those conversations on a regular basis do kind of regular reviews of privilege and what escalations are necessary. And also it really helps your security teams with those threat modeling, because now you have a way to describe what can talk to what where, which in this kind of, it's on the network now, it can access anything. It's really hard for a security team to be able to wrap their head around and apply their best skills and hardening into the right places without that information.
And if I can add, how many web servers are running as local admins on their box? Way too many. And, to what Zach's saying, you're going to need to work in a test environment and figure out what is the least common privilege you need. Because in a lot of cases, you don't need to be a local admin. The reason why people do local admin is because some applications, even the older stuff, needed access into even things like registry. And people don't understand you have to go in and apply permissions in registry. People just think, oh, it's this dumping ground. You either have it or you don't. And the reality is you can fine tune it down to just a given key and area. And again, it's just a lack of, well, I need this application to run, so I'm going to give it local admin rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you guys this then. If I look at this, shouldn't there be like an AI program somewhere that just tells me, what privileges are over provisioned and can be easily escalated? What scenarios are likely to be the highest level of risk? I mean, we're seeing generative AI for everything, but how smart can generative AI get in this regard and kind of help us out?
Zach, you want to take this?
There's a whole can of worms with AI. I think it's, as Chris alluded to earlier, it's both a useful security tool as well as an adversarial tool. I think we're starting to see some capabilities there. I will never claim to see the future of AI, so that's not my specialty for sure. But I think the value that AI can bring, maybe not yet in remediating and like solving the problems, but certainly helping us understand things better. So organizing information for our teams better, helping us learn, better developer training, right? Making that easier to understanding the impact of given vulnerabilities, right? Using AI to understand, what does this thing mean? Like, it's a knowledge tool where its ability to kind of distill and confirm information can be very helpful. It can still be wrong a fair bit of the time, and with security that can be challenging. But I think the ability to see kind of what is the expected behavior, that behavioral analysis, which we use generative AI, regression modeling and what's the word I'm looking for? Understanding deviations from the normal, are things we've been applying with machine learning and stuff for a while to understand and detect aberrations in the behavior of applications. So we're still seeing that and profiling an application to understand what expected behavior is, and that can help set baselines. So to your point, Mike, help understand, these are the things it does commonly. What I've found is still a little tricky just as an application, a systems engineer and application developer, is often there's like the weird corner cases, right? The exception path, like making sure that those profiling and all that cover all the code paths in your application, is especially legacy stuff where it's much more monolithic and you have a lot of more complex logic in one application container. I use the term abstractly. That can be still challenging to get it right. But I think as a learning and kind of insight tool, it's getting much better at that. So I definitely would propose using it to kind of help you understand and model and get visibility into what's happening. The decision making is still not quite there. I think we're getting to some interesting places with developer workflows, being able to quickly remediate the low hanging fruit, get dependencies updated easily and quickly respond to simple PRs or generate PRs from issues filed by security teams, for example. So I think we're getting into a case where it can help us with kind of the baseline work, so we can focus our most trained and most knowledgeable contextual folks on the hardest problems, which is certainly a useful value.
Right. Well, and the reality is applications are changing with every release. So what may be acceptable today may not be, in the future. And it also depends, is this a shared resource or not? I mean, Zach nailed it on the head. The profiling, the threat modeling, trying to identify what's coming in, coming out. There's great tools out there that will help you identify what ports are being hit and why things are happening. And AI is not ready to do all this automation for you. It will give you great advice. I always talk about it from a development standpoint as being like a co-pilot, somebody that you can, ask a question. Hey, what have you seen? And it lists out, or what do you think about this? But really, ultimately, it's still the person, the human in the chain that really needs to be the final decision maker, because sometimes AI, especially with generative AI, can hallucinate or give you bad advice or bad answers. And so you just have to be very, very cautious when you're working with AI to, put some common sense in. If you ask it a question and it comes out with an answer, ask, does this look legitimate? Is this correct? Because sometimes it may hallucinate and give you a wrong answer.
That's true. However, it's not like I have not been convincingly given a wrong answer by a person too. So, it just goes both ways. Zach, it's an interesting question that one of our attendees is asking, but basically he's suggesting that breaches have become so commonplace that people just shrug them off, and as such, we've become a little inured to the whole thing, and we're not, and people don't pay as much attention. They're not looking at the news of the day and going, "Oh my God, another breach." It's more like, it's Tuesday, there must be a breach somewhere, right? I guess he's positing the theory that, the people who own these companies, investors, creditors, shareholders, just need to step up and say, we can't tolerate this stuff anymore, and we're not going to tolerate it, and because they're the ones ultimately who pay for it, right?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see motion in several government, across the world around thinking about who's responsible for these, right? Who is, are there liability or are there legal ramifications for this stuff, and due diligence kind of concerns about, are companies putting forward, are they doing the most they can within reason to protect against this stuff? And so I think that is where I've been watching and trying to see kind of where the wind is blowing and how prescriptive will they be. And that's where those goalposts are always evolving, right? As the state of the art gets better, what worked 10, 15 years ago to say, we did our best is not going to cut it anymore. And so that's where the legal ramifications may come to play. I think we haven't seen where that's going yet, but we're starting to hear kind of rumblings with various government and regulatory frameworks talking about like much more in-depth security, not just best practice, but very specific guidelines, like SBOM requirements. We see, runtime checking and continuous monitoring of X, Y, and Z as being part of kind of this regulatory framework. And so that's where I think it will pervade. And I think what we'll see is more of that will permeate other sectors as well. So not just the traditional highly regulated sectors, finance and healthcare, but it'll start blending out as more companies are handling, and there's lots more connection between various sectors of the industry. Those lines become a little more blurry, and so we'll see it apply a little more broadly. But that's a bit of a prediction. But I think that's one of the things that could change the conversation, not just from an internal, board of directors or shareholders acceptance, but external entities saying this is no longer acceptable. You have to show us that you're evolving your security practices and staying with the best practice in the industry.
Do you mind if I throw something?
Right, Chris, go ahead.
Real quick. I think the government's getting tired because, the fact that, okay, now we need SBOMs. All right, now you need to start thinking about SQL injections. The government's getting tired of companies just not doing anything. And, the reality is if a company doesn't have any real push to do something, they're not really going to go spend the money or effort. If you could have something that's mostly secure and some board members feel like that may be adequate enough. But the reality is a lot of companies just aren't doing enough. And so the government's jumping in and saying, look, here's some minimum best standards that you're going to have to aim for. And really with breaches, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And, as the world has identified, as long as you're doing what you can and actually applying the best practices and really taking security seriously, you're kicking that can down the road for when that's going to happen. And hopefully it never does. But, if somebody really wants to break into a company, they're going to find a way.
Mm-hmm. So does that mean, Chris, to follow up to its logical conclusion, that we're just going to have to wait till somebody hauls off some developers and puts them in prison for writing insecure software that was blatantly, too easy for somebody to crack, and they just ignored best practices? Is that where we're headed?
No. I hope not. The reality is AI is not going to write all your code for you. You're still going to need the human. The developer, realistically, it just, and this is an interesting question, because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And really, it's how do you hold a company accountable? Because the reality, if you look at all the breaches that we're all part of, right? You find, hey, I get a letter or an email, hey, I'm part of this other breach, and I'm part of this other breach, and we'll give you free credit monitoring for a year. The reality is if I could stack those up, I think I've got credit monitoring now for the next 30 years. The question becomes, how can you find a better way to make companies more accountable to gross negligence? And that's really what it comes down to. If you're hiring a junior developer or a guy right out of school, you need good mentorship. You need somebody to be able to help show them the right way and put the time and effort. And some companies don't want to do that because they feel like, hey, look, I'm going to spend 2 years on this guy. He's going to jump ship and make double the money somewhere else. And so companies need to be a little bit more better focused on their developers, building a good environment that they're growing, the mentorship's there, and really be security first focused. Do the education, the training for security. If a company's been compromised and they have great security implemented, they have the developer training, the developers have done really well on their training and the things, it's going to happen. And I don't think putting a developer in jail is the answer.
All right, folks. Well, believe it or not, an hour has flown by. We've been a fabulous conversation, and I would just say last thing on Chris's point there. As the old rabbi used to say, from your lips to God's ears, hopefully something good's going to happen and things are going to change. But if we all kind of put our heads around to it, we will hopefully get there sooner than later. Gentlemen, thank you for your insights. Jared, take us home.
All right. I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's program. But before we close out, just a reminder that we do have the survey in the handout section. You'll also receive a pop-up here shortly. Once we close out, it's 4 questions. It'll take you less than a minute. If you want to fill that out, that would be very helpful for us. It helps us know how to guide and what to do on our next program. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining. Chris, Zach, Mike, thank you for joining as well. If you guys don't have any final words, I'm going to go ahead and close this out and say goodbye.
I want to thank all the attendees for the great questions, because it makes our life easier. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for having me.